So basically, the way I've organized my thought process is that I'll provide an overview which involves, I'll provide a context and background of this particular subject. Then I'll talk about why the extent of need for climate finance and why there is limited, actually very limited access to climate finance in Africa. And finally, I'll talk about how we can increase access to climate finance in Africa. So that's the way I've sort of organized my thought process. Okay. But to provide context and background, Abla, what you may know, I'm sure you are a lot of people on this webinar will be aware of the fact that Africa is a tiny emitter of historical anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. To be precise, it's actually less than 3% of global historical greenhouse gas emissions. And yet, Africa bears the brunt of climate change impact. And just to sort of drive this home, 9 out of 10 and 35 out of 45 most vulnerable countries to climate change in the world are in Africa, with agriculture as the most exposed sector because we rely a lot on rainfall. And as a result, it is projected that climate change will reduce yields of Africa's rain-fed staple crops by between 8 to 22% over the next 20 years. And 20 years is important because we understand the latest Global Center on Adaptation indicates that Africa's climate change is locked in for 20 years. So irrespective of what we do, we will see these impacts over the next 20 years. So how does this manifest? I mean, I'm sure the images of the 2019 cyclones Idai, Kenneth, and Kenneth in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe are still fresh in most of our minds. And their impacts continue to hurt those economies. Just to be precise, the cyclones affected about 3 million people, 50 of whom were children, and caused 1,000 deaths, damaging infrastructure estimated at 2.8 billion and destroying more than 1 million acres of cropland and 100,000 homes. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. And the predicted increase in frequency and severity of adverse events is coming to pass, as evidenced by the cyclones Anna and Bastirai, which visited Southern Africa this year, causing more deaths and further damage, including to infrastructure. So coming to the need for climate finance, according to the African Economic Outlook, which is a publication by our bank, the continent loses between 5% and 15% of its GDP to climate change impacts. Hence, Africa already incurs $7 to $15 billion per year due to climate change, and which IMF projects could rise to $50 billion per year by 2030. And even this is a tiny amount of the projected of Africa's projected climate finance needs, which again, according to the African Economic Outlook, which we released in May this year, is estimated at $127 billion per year through 2030. That's the one side of things, that's the need side of it. Yet Africa only receives 3% of global climate finance flows, which in 2020 equated to only $19 billion. Okay, that is for sub-Saharan Africa. It may be slightly higher if the Northern African portion is disaggregated from the 2.5 billion allocated to Middle East and North Africa, but still very small nevertheless. Compare this. East Asia and the Pacific, mostly China and Japan, accounted for 47% of global climate finance in 2020, which amounts to $296 billion. So then, despite this skewness, why the limited access to climate finance in Africa? I think this is important. Among the reasons cited for the limited access to climate finance in Africa includes, number one, the global climate finance architecture, which is complex, resource intensive, and prioritizes, this is very important, it prioritizes mitigation, which receives about 90% of the available climate finance. In contrast, adaptation and resilience, which, considering the worsening climate change impacts on Africa, and indeed in developing countries, which is the primary concern, only accounts for 10%. That's one of the reasons of the limited access to climate finance in Africa. Secondly, we have weak absorption and limited implementation capacity among governments, which leads to inability to develop bankable adaptation and mitigation projects. The problem is particularly acute in adaptation projects, which are considered commercially unattractive as the methodology for quantifying and ascribing value to adaptation benefits is at early stage of development. The third reason for limited access is the limited coordination among relevant agencies and national designated authorities for climate funds. For example, you'll find that the entity that is involved in mobilizing climate finance lies maybe in the Ministry of Environment, while in actual fact, it should be in the Ministry of Finance. So there needs to be coordination, very good coordination between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment. Then we all know this, and although it's rarely spoken about, there is lack of prioritization of climate finance in national development plans. This is in the light of competing development needs amidst widening fiscal deficits and post-COVID-19 recovery efforts. Moreover, and this is the reality, there is urgency to finance frequent climate-related disasters as opposed to financing for adaptation. Further, there are limited incentives to promote green technologies and attract private climate finance, particularly to support adaptation and resilience. So how do we increase access to climate finance? I think this is the crux of today's session. In my view, concerted efforts must be made to increase access to climate finance in Africa. In this regard, commitment regarding the plan by developed nations to deliver the famous, or infamous if you want to call it that way, $100 billion goal urgently and through 2025, as well as pledges made by many developed countries to increase the provision of climate finance to support adaptation in developed countries are imperative. However, and this is my personal view, I believe there must be some form of affirmative action in favor of Africa by the global community, considering the minute contribution to the problem and the disproportionate impact on climate change on Africa. I think that might be necessary. And this is why, at the bank, we have proposed the establishment of a $13 billion climate action window for 2023 to 2025, which is going to be in parallel with our 16th replenishment of the African Development Fund, which is our contextual window, to provide dedicated resources for climate action. And in this particular case, 63% of the resources will be dedicated to adaptation. Further, the 32% of those resources, if they materialize, will be earmarked for mitigation, while 5% will be dedicated to technical assistance to attend to policy support and institutional capacity building with a view to creating the enabling environment required to catalyze investment in climate action and increase access to finance, including through the private sector. In other words, addressing the obstacles that curtail access to climate, which I mentioned slightly earlier. Other avenues that could be used to access climate finance, and this is unique at the bank, is what we call the adaptation benefits mechanism, which we have designed as a credible and transparent mechanism through which donors, corporations, and ultimately consumers can contribute towards the cost of adapting to climate change. Payments for adaptation projects developers are made in return for certified adaptation benefits, which will help to make adaptation projects financially attractive, especially to the private sector. At the same time, the purchasers can use the certified adaptation benefits to report in a transparent manner to support given genuine adaptation needs in developing countries. ABM, as we call it, was adopted as a non-market tool for settlement of verifiable adaptation benefits and referenced in Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement. The other things that you can think about is deploying innovative climate finance instruments to mobilize domestic climate finance in Africa. In this regard, green bonds and loans, sustainability or sustainability-linked bonds and loans, as well as debt for climate swaps and more efficient and better priced carbon markets could be important sources of climate finance. Again, countries can also mobilize domestic capital through carbon markets, especially when emissions are traded at true price of carbon. Other innovative climate finance instruments could include realignment of fossil fuel subsidies and other progressive tax instruments deployable in key sectors such as energy and transport. Finally, could, and this is a question I'm posing because it's a bit slightly more complicated, could special drawing rights allocated to willing developed countries be allocated to African countries through prescribed holders, such as the African Development Bank Group, to finance climate resilient development and just energy transitions in Africa? I'll stop there with that particular question, Abla. Thank you very much.